72 years old, hands trembling, tears streaming, all of Hollywood on its feet, applauding. 2018. Henry Winkler holds the Emmy that should have arrived 40 years earlier. But this golden statue isn't just a belated award. It's a collective apology. The acknowledgement that the industry had made a brutal mistake. Because the man on that stage isn't just a veteran actor finally getting his due. He's someone who spent decades being punished for his own success, who was called stupid as a child, who became the ultimate symbol of confidence for an entire generation, and who, precisely because of that, became invisible. Henry Winkler, the Fonz, the leather jacket in the Smithsonian, the Ayyyy that defined the 70s, 30 million people watching every week. The coolest man in America. But what happens when your greatest success becomes your biggest prison? When Hollywood celebrates you, then discards you? When directors tell you, you're too good to be anyone else? How does a cultural icon end up rejected for decades? Why does an actor at the peak of fame become unemployable? And what takes 43 years for an Emmy to finally arrive? Before we answer, we need to go back to a boy in New York who believed every cruel word his parents whispered. A kid whose brain worked differently, magnificently, but in a world that only measured intelligence with a single ruler. The story of how that boy became a symbol, then a warning, and finally, undeniably, a legend. Henry Franklin Winkler was born on October 30th, 1945 in Manhattan, into a home where silence carried more weight than words, and disappointment hung in the air like cigarette smoke that never cleared. His parents, Ilse Anna Marie and Harry Irving Winkler, were German Jews who had fled Nazi Germany in 1939, escaping with their lives but leaving behind everything else. Family, wealth, identity. They arrived in New York carrying trauma so deep they could never speak its name, and raised their son in the shadow of survival that had calcified into something cold and unforgiving. In that household, excellence wasn't encouraged. It was demanded, expected, required as proof that the sacrifices of escape had meant something. Harry had rebuilt himself as a successful lumber company president. Ilse ran the home with precision that bordered on severity. And Henry, their only son for the first years, was supposed to be their triumph, their vindication, the American dream personified. But Henry's brain had other plans. He couldn't read the way other children read. Words danced and twisted on the page. Letters reversed themselves. Sentences that seemed clear to everyone else dissolved into alphabet soup before his eyes. Teachers called him lazy. Classmates called him slow. And at home, in the language of German-accented English that never quite softened, his parents called him something worse. Dumb Hund. Dumb dog. It wasn't said with violence, it was said with disappointment, which cut deeper. Each time Henry brought home a report card marked with C's and D's, each time he stumbled over a passage in Hebrew school, each time he forgot instructions or mixed up directions, the phrase would surface, sometimes as a mutter, sometimes as a weary sigh, always as a verdict. Years later, Henry would recall those moments with a pain that never fully healed. When your own parents tell you you're not smart enough, he said quietly in an interview, you believe them. I believed them for years. See? What neither Henry nor his parents knew was that he wasn't stupid. He was dyslexic. But in the 1950s, dyslexia wasn't a diagnosis. It was simply failure. Schools had no accommodations, no understanding, no pathway for brains that processed information differently. You either kept up or you fell behind. And Henry was falling. School became a daily humiliation. At McBurney School, a private institution on Manhattan's Upper West Side, where his parents had enrolled him hoping for excellence, Henry felt like an imposter. He watched other boys breeze through assignments that took him hours. He memorized rather than read, developed elaborate workarounds, and lived in constant fear of being called on, of being exposed, of proving once again that his parents were right about him. But there was one place where the words didn't matter. One sanctuary where his brain, so criticized everywhere else, suddenly became an asset. The theater. At 11 years old, Henry wandered into a children's theater workshop and discovered something that would save his life. On stage, he didn't need to read quickly. He could memorize, he could listen and absorb, he could watch others and mirror, and most remarkably, he could become someone else entirely. Someone confident, someone powerful, someone who wasn't a dumb dog. "When I acted," he later confessed, "I was free. I wasn't the kid who couldn't read. I was whoever I needed to be." His parents didn't understand it. To them, theater was frivolous, a distraction from real achievement, from the professional success they'd mapped out for him. Doctor, lawyer, businessman, something respectable. But Henry clung to it like a lifeboat in a stormy sea. By high school, at the elite McBurney School, and later at Emerson College in Boston, the pattern was set. Henry scraped through academics, doing just enough to survive, while pouring every ounce of passion into drama. He joined every production, memorized every part, lived and breathed performance because it was the only place where he didn't feel defective. His parents' disappointment deepened. When he announced his intention to pursue acting professionally, the response was withering. "You're wasting your life," his father said. His mother simply shook her head, the gesture more painful than words. But in 1967, something miraculous happened. Despite his academic struggles, despite barely graduating from Emerson, despite being told repeatedly he wasn't good enough, Henry Winkler was accepted to the Yale School of Drama. Yale, one of the most prestigious acting programs in the world. It should have been vindication, proof that he had talent, that his brain worked just fine in the ways that mattered. But when he called home with the news, expecting pride, maybe even an apology, his father's response stopped him cold. "I hope you have a backup plan." No congratulations, no recognition of the achievement. Just another reminder that in his parents' eyes, he was still falling short. Still the dumb dog chasing a dream that would lead nowhere. At Yale, Henry threw himself into the craft with ferocious intensity. He studied under legendary teachers. He absorbed techniques. He worked twice as hard as everyone else because he had to. Memorizing scripts through repetition, since reading them quickly, was impossible. His dyslexia remained undiagnosed, unnamed, a secret shame he carried alone. But talent, when fueled by desperation and determination, becomes unstoppable. By the time Henry graduated with his Master of Fine Arts in 1970, he had transformed himself into a formidable actor. Trained, disciplined, ready. He moved to New York, then Los Angeles, ready to prove everyone wrong. Ready to show his parents, his teachers, everyone who'd ever called him stupid, that Henry Winkler could make it. What he didn't know was that success would arrive faster than he could imagine, and that it would become the most beautiful prison he'd ever known. The boy who couldn't read was about to become the coolest man in America, and that transformation would nearly destroy him. In 1973, Henry Winkler was 27 years old, living in a tiny Los Angeles apartment, surviving on commercial residuals and the occasional television guest spot. He'd landed small roles on shows like The Mary Tyler Moore Show and The Bob Newhart Show, enough to pay rent, not enough to quiet the voice in his head that still whispered his father's doubt. Then came the audition that would rewrite his entire existence. Happy Days, a nostalgic sitcom set in 1950s Milwaukee, was looking for someone to play Arthur Fonzarelli, a minor character, a greaser, a tough guy who'd appear in a few episodes to add edge to the wholesome Cunningham family narrative. The role was small. The character barely had lines in the pilot script. Henry walked into that audition wearing his own jacket, the only leather one he owned, and made a choice that revealed instincts honed by years of being underestimated. He didn't read Fonzie as a thug. He read him as a man whose toughness was armor, whose cool was a survival mechanism, whose confidence masked vulnerability. I understood him immediately, Henry recalled decades later. The Fonz was a guy who walked into every room like he owned it, because he was terrified people would see he didn't belong. I knew that feeling in my bones. The producers saw something electric. They didn't just cast him. They rewrote the show around him. When Happy Days premiered in January 1974, Fonzie was supposed to be a background character. But audiences didn't care about the Cunninghams. They cared about the guy in the leather jacket who could start a jukebox with a single hit, who made every woman in town swoon, who said, "Ayyyy," and made it the sound of pure confidence. Within months, Fonzie transformed from a supporting role into the axis around which the entire show revolved. By the second season, Henry Winkler's face was on lunchboxes, posters, magazines. The leather jacket became iconic. The thumbs up became a cultural gesture. Fonzie wasn't just a character, he was a phenomenon. Henry had achieved what seemed impossible. At 28, he was a star. The dumb dog had become the coolest man in America. But fame is a contract written in invisible ink, and Henry was about to discover what he'd actually signed. By 1976, Happy Days was the #1 show on television. Over 30 million people tuned in every week. Henry Winkler couldn't walk down a street without being mobbed, couldn't eat at a restaurant without cameras appearing, couldn't exist as Henry, only as Fonzie. The show's success was staggering. Merchandising exploded. Fonzie dolls, Fonzie board games, Fonzie cereal. The leather jacket he wore on set was eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution, enshrined as a piece of American cultural history, alongside Abraham Lincoln's hat and Dorothy's ruby slippers. For a boy who'd been called stupid, who'd been told he'd never amount to anything, this should have been pure vindication. And part of it was. Henry was making money. He was respected on set. He was beloved by millions. But the character was consuming him. Everywhere he went, people didn't see Henry Winkler. They saw the Fonz. They wanted the thumbs up, the Ayyyy, the swagger. They wanted him to be perpetually cool, perpetually confident, perpetually the guy who never struggled with anything. And Henry, who still carried the scars of childhood rejection, who still fought daily with words that twisted on the page, who still heard dumb dog in quiet moments, had to perform that confidence endlessly, both on screen and off. I became a prisoner of my own success, he admitted years later, the pain still audible in his voice. The show controlled everything, his image, his availability, his future. When he asked to direct episodes, he was told no. When he wanted to explore other roles, he was reminded of his contract. When he tried to take film roles during hiatus, he discovered something devastating. Hollywood didn't want Henry Winkler, the actor. They wanted Fonzie. And if they couldn't have Fonzie exactly, they didn't want him at all. Directors would meet with him, smile politely, and say, "We love you, but we need someone who can disappear into the role. You're too recognizable. Translation, you're Fonzie. You'll only ever be Fonzie. Henry took the rejections with grace publicly, but privately, the fear metastasized. What happens when the show ends? What happens when America moves on from Fonzie? What happens to Henry Winkler when the leather jacket comes off? The money was good, the fame was intoxicating, but the future looked like a cliff edge rushing closer with every season. His parents, even in the face of unprecedented success, remained unimpressed. His father watched Happy Days and offered critique, not praise. His mother worried about when he'd settle down, get serious, stop playing pretend for a living. The validation he'd chased his entire life remained just out of reach, even as millions celebrated him. He threw himself deeper into the role. If Fonzie was his prison, he'd be the best prisoner possible. He perfected every gesture, every line reading, every snap of the fingers. He made Fonzie more human, more nuanced, showing vulnerability beneath the leather. The work earned him 3 Golden Globe nominations. 3. And he won 2. But when the Emmy nominations came, year after year, he was overlooked. The awards he truly wanted, the ones that meant respect from his industry peers, never came. Being the Fonz was like being locked in a golden cage, he confessed. Everyone could see me, but no one could see me. Happy Days ran for 11 seasons, 255 episodes. Over a decade of Henry's life poured into a single character. By the time it ended in 1984, he was 38 years old. He'd spent his entire 20s and most of his 30s as Arthur Fonzarelli. And when the show finally went off the air, when the sets were struck and the cast scattered, Henry Winkler stood in the rubble of his success and realized the terrible truth. The Fonz had made him famous, but fame had made him unemployable. The 1980s should have been Henry Winkler's second act. He was established, beloved, wealthy, connected. He had everything an actor could want, except the one thing that mattered most: work. The auditions came at first. Producers remembered him fondly. Casting directors brought him in out of respect for what he'd achieved. But the meetings always ended the same way. "You're great, Henry, but we're looking for someone different." Different meant not Fonzie. Different meant they couldn't see past the leather jacket even when he wasn't wearing it. He auditioned for dramatic roles. Rejected. Too associated with comedy. He auditioned for comedic roles. Rejected. We need fresh faces. He auditioned for television movies, indie films, Broadway shows. The answer was always a variation of no, delivered with apologetic smiles that didn't soften the blow. One casting director told him point blank, "Henry, every time you walk in the room, we hear Ayyyy in our heads. We can't unhear it. And that means we can't cast you." The rejection wasn't about talent. It was about perception. And perception, once cemented in the public consciousness, is almost impossible to shatter. Friends from his Yale days were winning Oscars, headlining Broadway, building diverse careers. Henry watched from the sidelines, the former superstar now a cautionary tale whispered in acting classes. Don't get typecast like Henry Winkler. The cruelty of it was suffocating. He'd worked so hard to prove he wasn't stupid, to show his parents he could succeed, to build something meaningful. And he had succeeded beyond imagination. But that very success had become a wall between him and everything he wanted to do next. Financial pressure mounted. The Happy Days money was good, but it wouldn't last forever. He had a family now, married to Stacy Weitzman in 1978. 2 children who needed stability. The responsible thing would have been to accept whatever work came, grateful just to be employed. But Henry made a choice that revealed either courage or stubbornness, perhaps both. He refused to play Fonzie again. Ever. Producers offered him spin-offs, sequels, reunion specials, easy money, safe choices. He turned them all down. "I didn't want to be 50 years old still doing the thumbs up," he explained. "I'd rather struggle as Henry than succeed as a character who wasn't me." So he struggled. He took teaching jobs, passing on what he'd learned at Yale to young actors. He directed when anyone would let him. He produced. He wrote children's books with Lynn Oliver, creating a character named Hank Zipser, a dyslexic kid who struggled in school but succeeded through creativity and heart. The books were personal in ways Henry couldn't fully articulate at the time. Hank Zipser was the child Henry had been, given the understanding and support Henry never received. But publishing success didn't translate to acting opportunities. Hollywood has a short memory for has-beens, and that's what Henry had become. A relic, a nostalgic reference point, the guy from that old show their parents watched. The invisibility was familiar. He'd been invisible as a child, the boy who couldn't read dismissed as slow. He'd been invisible in his parents' eyes, never quite measuring up, and now he was invisible again. But this time it stung worse, because he'd tasted the opposite. He knew what it felt like to matter. Depression crept in, not the clinical kind that demanded intervention, but the quiet erosion of hope that comes from endless rejection. The voice that whispered, "Maybe they're right," grew louder. Maybe he'd only ever been good for one role. Maybe Fonzie was all he had. His marriage held strong. Stacy believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. His children gave him purpose beyond career. But the professional wilderness felt endless. Years blurred together. Small roles, guest appearances, direct-to-video movies, work that paid bills but didn't satisfy the hunger to create something meaningful. He was working, technically, but he wasn't building, wasn't growing, wasn't the actor he knew he could be. In interviews, he stayed gracious, never bitter, never blamed the industry or the typecasting. "The Fonz gave me everything," he'd say with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm grateful." But privately, the cost was staggering. 2 decades of his life, his 30s, 40s, and into his 50s. Wandering in a career desert, punished for a success he'd earned honestly. And through it all, the dyslexia remained undiagnosed. Scripts still twisted. Words still danced. And Henry still believed, somewhere deep inside, that maybe his parents had been right all along. Maybe he was the dumb dog just pretending to be smart. In 1976, at the height of Fonzie mania, when Henry Winkler was the most famous face on television, his stepson Jed was struggling in school. Report cards came home marked with frustration. Teachers used words like unfocused and underachieving. The pattern was achingly familiar. Stacy, worried, took Jed to be tested. And that's when the word entered their lives. Dyslexia. The psychologist explained it carefully. A learning difference, not a deficiency. The brain processing information through different pathways. Completely unrelated to intelligence. With proper support, dyslexic children could thrive. Henry sat in that office, listening to the description of how Jed's brain worked, and felt the floor drop out beneath him. Every symptom matched. The reversed letters, the difficulty reading aloud, the need to memorize rather than scan, the feeling of being stupid while knowing, somehow, that you weren't. "Do adults have this?" he asked quietly. The psychologist nodded. "Absolutely." Many go their whole lives undiagnosed. At 31 years old, at the peak of fame, Henry Winkler finally had a name for the thing that had haunted him since childhood. He wasn't a dumb dog. His brain wasn't broken. It was just different. The revelation should have been liberating. And in some ways, it was. He finally understood why reading scripts took him 3 times longer than other actors. Why he'd developed elaborate memorization techniques. Why school had been torture, while performance had been freedom. But the diagnosis also brought rage. Rage at a school system that had labeled him rather than helped him. Rage at parents who'd called him stupid instead of curious about why he struggled. Rage at all the years spent believing he was fundamentally flawed. "I mourned for that little boy," Henry said decades later, tears in his eyes. "The one who believed he was dumb. I wanted to go back and tell him, 'You're not stupid. Your brain is beautiful. It just works differently.'" He couldn't go back, but he could go forward differently. Henry threw himself into dyslexia advocacy. He spoke at schools. He funded research. He partnered with Lynn Oliver to create the Hank Zipser book series, giving dyslexic children the hero he'd never had growing up. But he told almost no one in Hollywood. The diagnosis remained private, shared only with close friends and family. Because even with understanding, even with a medical explanation, the fear remained. If people knew, would they think he was less capable? Would it become another reason not to hire him? The dumb dog label had scarred him too deeply. Even with proof that it was wrong, the wound remained tender. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Henry Winkler kept working, kept fighting, kept showing up even when the industry seemed determined to forget him. He directed episodes of sitcoms. He produced shows. He took character roles in forgettable films. He appeared on reality shows, nostalgic specials, anything that paid. The work was steady enough to survive, but never substantial enough to redefine him. His children grew up watching their father navigate rejection with grace. Zoe and Max saw a man who'd been on top of the world treated like an afterthought, yet never became bitter. Never stopped trying. Never gave up on the belief that good work would eventually be recognized. "My father taught me that dignity matters more than success," Max would later say. "He showed us how to lose with grace." But Henry wasn't trying to lose gracefully. He was trying to survive until the world was ready to see him differently. In 2003, he landed a recurring role on Arrested Development, playing Barry Zuckerkorn, the Bluth family's incompetent lawyer. It was comedy, but different. Absurd. Self-aware. The show was critically acclaimed but low-rated, canceled after 3 seasons. Still, something shifted. Critics who'd dismissed him for decades suddenly noticed. "Henry Winkler proves he's more than Fonzie," one review read. It was backhanded, but it was recognition. More roles followed. Small but memorable. Parks and Recreation. Royal Pains. Children's Hospital. Nothing that made him a household name again, but enough to remind people he could act. He could adapt. He could do more than snap his fingers and say, "Ayyyy." He kept writing children's books. The Hank Zipser series grew to 17 novels, selling millions of copies, reaching children who struggled exactly as he had. At book signings, dyslexic kids would whisper to him, "I thought I was dumb." And Henry would kneel down, look them in the eyes, and say firmly, "You're not dumb. You're different. And different is powerful." The books won awards. They were adapted into a British Broadcasting Corporation television series. They mattered in ways that transcended entertainment. But Hollywood still saw him as the Fonz who wrote cute kids' books. Not as a serious actor. Not as someone capable of carrying dramatic weight. His parents passed away, his father in 1995, his mother in 2001, without ever fully acknowledging what he'd achieved. There were no deathbed reconciliations, no tearful admissions that they'd been wrong to call him a dumb dog, just silence where closure should have been. Henry grieved not just their deaths, but the relationship that had never been, the approval that would never come, the wound that would never fully heal. And still, he kept working, kept auditioning, kept believing that somewhere, somehow, the right role would find him. What he didn't know was that patience, that relentless showing up despite decades of being overlooked, was about to pay off in ways he couldn't imagine. At 72 years old, when most actors have long since retired, when the industry had written him off as a nostalgia act, a script landed on Henry Winkler's desk. It was dark, violent, unexpected. A comedy about a depressed hitman trying to become an actor. The character's name was Gene Cousineau, an acting teacher, narcissistic, damaged, desperate for relevance. Henry read it and saw himself. Not literally, but emotionally. The hunger for recognition, the fear of being forgotten, the performance of confidence masking deep insecurity. He auditioned, and for the first time in decades, Hollywood saw him. Not as Fonzie, as Henry. When they called his name, Henry Winkler didn't immediately stand. For a fraction of a second, he sat frozen, as if his brain couldn't process what his ears had just heard. Henry Winkler, Barry, 72 years old, 5 decades in the industry, 44 years since Fonzie made him famous. And this, finally, was the moment. The Microsoft Theater erupted. But this wasn't ordinary applause. Every person in that room stood. Actors who'd grown up watching Happy Days, directors who'd rejected him for decades, producers who'd told him he was too Fonzie to cast. They were all standing. Henry made his way to the stage, legs shaking, eyes flooding. When he reached the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces, the dam broke completely. "Oh my goodness," he managed, voice cracking. "I wrote this 43 years ago." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but it was gentle, understanding. They knew what he meant. He'd been waiting since 1975, when he'd first been nominated for playing Fonzie. 3 nominations, 0 wins, then nothing for decades. He pulled crumpled notes from his pocket, prepared words dissolving into raw emotion. "If you stay at the table long enough, the chips come to you. And tonight, I got to clear the table." His voice broke on table. He looked at Stacy in the audience, his wife of 40 years, who'd believed in him through the wilderness. He thought of Zoe and Max, his children who'd watched him lose with dignity. He thought of Jed, his stepson whose dyslexia diagnosis had unlocked his own understanding. And perhaps, in some corner of his heart, he thought of his parents. The ones who'd called him a dumb dog. The ones who'd never lived to see this moment. The approval he'd chased that would never come from them, arriving instead from an industry that had taken 4 decades to recognize what he'd always known. He could act. He could carry weight. He could be more than Fonzie. Backstage, reporters swarmed him. "How does it feel?" they asked. A question both too simple and too vast to answer. "It feels like breathing after holding your breath for 43 years, he said quietly. Gene Cousineau, the character Henry played in Barry, was everything Hollywood had refused to let him be for decades. Dramatic, complicated, selfish, broken, real. The show, created by Alec Berg and Bill Hader, was a dark comedy about a hitman who stumbles into an acting class and discovers a passion for performance. Gene is the teacher, A failed actor clinging to relevance through his students, desperate for recognition, terrified of obscurity. In lesser hands, Gene could have been a caricature. But Henry brought something achingly authentic. Every scene where Gene performed confidence while drowning in insecurity, Henry didn't have to imagine. He'd lived it. Every moment where Gene chased validation from people who'd moved on, Henry knew that hunger in his bones. Every instance of Gene being dismissed despite his talent, Henry had experienced 1,000 times. "I didn't have to research Gene," Henry admitted in an interview. "I just had to remember." The role was demanding in ways television hadn't allowed him to be in decades. Dramatic monologues, emotional breakdowns, moral complexity. And Henry, the man Hollywood had written off as a nostalgia act, delivered with a ferocity that stunned critics. "Winkler is a revelation," wrote the New York Times. "How did we forget Henry Winkler could act like this?" asked Vanity Fair. The answer was simple. They hadn't forgotten. They'd never known. They'd never looked past the leather jacket to see what was underneath. Barry ran for 4 seasons. Each year, Henry was nominated for the Emmy. In 2018, he won. In 2019, 2022, and 2023, he was nominated again. At an age when most actors were collecting Lifetime Achievement Awards and fading into retirement, Henry Winkler was doing the best work of his career. The industry that had typecast him, that had rejected him for decades, suddenly couldn't get enough of him. Offers poured in. Diverse roles, dramatic parts, character work that let him stretch and grow. Directors who'd once dismissed him now called personally, apologizing for their blindness. But Henry held no grudges. "Bitterness is a prison," he said simply. "I spent too many years in one already." Today, at 78 years old, Henry Winkler has achieved something rare in Hollywood. He's redefined his legacy while still alive to see it. For an entire generation, he'll always be the Fonz. That's unchangeable, and Henry has made peace with it. "Fonzie gave me a life," he says now without resentment. "He gave me a platform. He gave me everything I have. I'm grateful." But for a new generation, he's Gene Cousineau. He's the voice of failure and resilience. He's proof that careers can have second acts, third acts, that it's never too late for recognition. And for millions of children and parents navigating dyslexia, he's Hank Zipzer. He's the author who turned his greatest struggle into stories that help kids see their difference as strength. The Hank Zipzer books have sold over 8 million copies worldwide. They've been translated into multiple languages. They've reached children in ways Henry could never have imagined when he was that frightened boy in New York who couldn't read. He speaks openly about dyslexia now. The shame is gone, replaced by fierce advocacy. "I spent my childhood thinking I was broken," he tells audiences. "I want every dyslexic child to know they're not broken. They're different. And different is exactly what the world needs." He funds dyslexia research. He visits schools. He works with organizations developing new teaching methods. The boy who was called stupid has become a champion for children who hear the same cruel labels. His marriage to Stacy has lasted over 45 years, a Hollywood rarity. His children have grown into kind, grounded adults who watched their father navigate fame and failure with equal grace. "My dad taught us that success isn't about being recognized," Zoe said in an interview. "It's about recognizing yourself, knowing your worth regardless of what others see." Henry Winkler didn't become an overnight success at 72. He became an overnight sensation after 50 years of showing up. Every audition he took in the wilderness years, every rejection he absorbed with dignity, Every time he chose to keep working rather than disappear. Every children's book he wrote when Hollywood wouldn't hire him. Every student he taught when directing opportunities dried up. All of it was staying at the table. The chips didn't come quickly. They didn't come easily. But they came. In 2019, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. His Happy Days castmates attended. His family stood beside him. And when he pressed his hands into the cement, it wasn't just Fonzie being honored. It was Henry. In interviews now, he's asked constantly about perseverance, about how he survived the wilderness, about advice for actors facing typecasting. His answer is always the same, delivered with the gentle wisdom of someone who's lived it. The only way out is through. You can't go around rejection. You can't skip the hard parts. You have to walk through the fire and trust that if you don't quit, if you don't let bitterness consume you, eventually you'll reach the other side. He pauses, then adds, and if you don't reach the other side, if recognition never comes, you still have your dignity. You still have the work itself. That has to be enough. But for Henry, recognition did come. Late? Yes. After decades of waiting. But it came. The boy who couldn't read grew up to write 35 books. The child called stupid earned a master's degree from Yale. The actor typecast as Fonzie won an Emmy for playing someone completely different. The man rejected for decades became proof that patience isn't passive. It's active. It's showing up every day, even when no one's watching. It's choosing dignity over bitterness. It's staying at the table when everyone tells you to leave. Henry Winkler's story isn't a fairy tale. It's better than that. It's real. It's proof that the labels people give you, even your own parents, don't define you unless you let them. It's evidence that success on someone else's timeline is still success. It's a reminder that the role that makes you famous doesn't have to be the role that defines you forever. And perhaps most importantly, it's a testament to the truth that our struggles, the very things we're most ashamed of, can become our greatest gifts if we're brave enough to share them. Henry doesn't hide his dyslexia anymore. He doesn't apologize for the decades of typecasting. He doesn't minimize the pain of parental rejection or industry dismissal. He owns all of it. And in owning it, he's transformed it into wisdom. I spent so many years trying to be someone I wasn't, he reflects. Trying to read like everyone else. Trying to be more than Fonzie. Trying to earn approval that was never coming. The freedom came when I stopped trying to be different and started embracing who I actually am. At 78, Henry Winkler still acts, still writes, still advocates for dyslexic children, still shows up with the same enthusiasm he brought to that first Happy Days audition in 1973. But now, he shows up as himself. Not as the Fonz, not as the character, as Henry. And the world, finally, is paying attention. The dumb dog became a legend, not despite the struggles, but because he refused to let them break him. And that might be the coolest thing of all.